The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Amber opened her eyes. The smell of fresh coffee already invaded her bedroom, mixing with the sweet aroma of flowers growing in Grandma Ruth's backyard. She stretched slowly, feeling the old wooden floor creak beneath her bare feet. At 16 years old, she already knew every sound of that house in Riverdale, a small town on the banks of the Black River in the heart of Louisiana. "Amber! Breakfast's on the table! It's getting cold!" Grandma Ruth's voice echoed from the kitchen, with that tone that mixed affection and authority, characteristic of small-town grandmothers. "Coming, Grandma," she replied, trying to tame her curly hair in front of the antique mirror. Seated at the solid wooden table, Amber watched her grandmother move around the kitchen with the agility that her 70 years allowed. She had arrived just 2 weeks ago to spend her school vacation, but time seemed to drag in Riverdale. She loved her grandmother, but the tranquility of the place sometimes weighed on someone accustomed to the rhythm of New Orleans. "Grandma, can I go for a walk after breakfast?" she asked, nibbling on a piece of cornbread. Grandma Ruth adjusted her glasses on the tip of her nose. "You may, but don't go to the riverside alone. Mr. Gerald said he saw large tracks near the bank." Amber discreetly rolled her eyes. Mr. Gerald, the local hunter, always had stories to tell about dangerous animals. Most of the time, they were exaggerations to impress the tourists who came to fish. After breakfast, Amber decided to explore the back of her grandmother's property, an area that bordered a small nature reserve. The heat was already intensifying, even though it was early, and the humidity made the air heavy. Dressed in jean shorts and a light t-shirt, she walked among the trees, observing the colorful birds that hopped between the branches. That's when she heard it. A distinct noise, different from the usual rustling of leaves in the wind. Something was moving among the denser bushes, producing dry sounds of breaking twigs. For a moment, she thought about returning home, but curiosity spoke louder. She approached, cautiously, feeling her heart accelerate with each step. The damp soil yielded slightly under her sneakers, leaving footprints that quickly filled with water from the earth. She carefully pushed aside some branches and then saw it. An anaconda, of impressive proportions, rested among fallen leaves and rotting logs. Its muscular, scaly body reflected the sunlight that pierced through the treetops. Amber felt her blood freeze in her veins. She had always heard stories about these reptiles, some capable of swallowing whole animals, but she had never been so close to one. When her eyes adjusted to the dimness of the place, she noticed something alarming. A deep and extensive cut marked the snake's body, which was breathing with visible difficulty. The injury seemed recent and serious. "My God," she whispered involuntarily. At the sound of her voice, the anaconda moved slightly, its eyes meeting Amber's. There was no aggression in that gaze, only pain, and something she interpreted as a silent plea. At that moment, all the fear she had felt seconds before began to transform into a strange compassion. The sound of the rocking chair on the porch of the house alerted Amber. If Grandma Ruth discovered the injured snake, she would certainly call Mr. Gerald or some other resident to get rid of the animal, and she knew well what that would mean. Amber slowly backed away, keeping her eyes on the injured anaconda. She needed to help that animal, but how? The idea of leaving it there, at the mercy of hunters or the elements, caused a tightness in her chest that she couldn't explain. She walked quickly back to the house, passing by Grandma Ruth without saying a word about what she had found. "Grandma, I'm going to the town square," she shouted from the door as she hurriedly put on her sandals. "Come back before lunch," her grandmother replied, "and watch out for that sun." Amber ran through the narrow, familiar streets of Riverdale. The morning heat was already intense, causing small beads of sweat to trickle down her forehead. The town was at its usual pace, fishermen returning from their morning work, ladies chatting by the windows, children running between the trees in the central square. That's when she spotted a different figure sitting on one of the benches. A young man of approximately 20, with dark hair and skin tanned by the Louisiana sun, was leafing through a thick book with total concentration. Amber recognized him immediately. Jason Parker, the biology student who had arrived a few weeks ago for field research. Grandma Ruth had mentioned that he was staying at Mr. Anthony's guest house near the port. "Jason Parker," she called hesitantly, stopping in front of him. The young man raised his eyes from the book, surprised by the interruption. "Yes?" replied, adjusting his dark-framed glasses. "I'm Amber, Ruth's granddaughter. I need your help," she said, the words coming out hurriedly. "It's an emergency." Jason closed the book, intrigued by the urgent tone of the girl he barely knew. "What happened?" Amber looked around, making sure no one was listening to them. "I found an injured anaconda near my grandmother's house. It has a huge cut on its body. It looks serious." The young biologist's face immediately transformed. A mixture of concern and scientific curiosity shone in his eyes. "Are you sure? Where exactly?" "In the back of the property, almost at the border with the reserve. It's hidden among some fallen trees." Jason jumped up, putting the book in his backpack. "Let's go there. We need to see its condition immediately." They walked quickly back to Grandma Ruth's house. Amber saw her grandmother chatting animatedly with a neighbor at the gate and waved from a distance, indicating to Jason that they should continue through the back to avoid raising suspicions. "My grandmother can't know about this," she explained in a low voice. "She's terrified of snakes and would call someone to, you know." Jason nodded, perfectly understanding the situation. In the region, it was common for animals considered dangerous to be eliminated without much questioning. When they reached the spot where Amber had found the anaconda, the biologist stopped, amazed by the size of the animal. He crouched at a safe distance, carefully observing the wound. "It's an adult specimen, possibly female," he commented. "The cut is deep, but doesn't seem to have hit vital organs, probably caused by some kind of trap." "Will she survive?" Amber asked, feeling a lump in her throat. "If we treat her soon, yes, but we need to take her to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Port Gibson. It's the only place nearby with the structure to treat an animal this size." Amber's eyes widened. "Port Gibson? That's at least 25 miles from here. How are we going to transport a snake this size without anyone noticing?" Jason furrowed his brow, thoughtful. "I have a pickup truck borrowed for my research. The problem is how to contain her safely for transport." "My grandfather's chest," Amber suddenly exclaimed. "In the shed, there's a large, sturdy wooden chest. My grandfather used it to store tools. It should be strong enough." The biologist nodded, but his expression remained concerned. Even weakened, a snake this size is still extremely strong and can be dangerous. We'll need to be very careful. "Have you done this before?" Amber asked, suddenly unsure. Jason hesitated for a moment before answering, nervously adjusting his glasses. "Theoretically, yes. In practice, this will be my first time with such a large specimen." "First time?" Amber repeated, feeling a chill run down her spine. The confidence she had placed in the young biologist wavered for an instant. Jason noticed her hesitation and smiled reassuringly. "I have the theoretical knowledge and have accompanied similar procedures during my internship at the Louisiana Wildlife Research Institute. I've just never handled a case like this on my own," he explained, turning his gaze back to the anaconda. "But if we do nothing, she won't survive." Amber observed the snake once more. The animal seemed even more vulnerable now, its breathing visibly difficult, the scales opaque around the wound. The decision was already made in her heart. "Okay, let's do this," she said with a determination that surprised even herself. "What do we need?" "Thick gloves, strong ropes, clean cloths to line the chest, and something to temporarily disinfect the wound," Jason enumerated. "We also need water and some hydrogen peroxide if your grandmother has any." "She should have all that." "Grandma keeps a little bit of everything," Amber replied, already thinking about how she would get the items without raising suspicions. "And how are we going to get my grandmother out of the house?" Jason scratched his chin, thoughtful. "We have to be quick. The truck is parked near the guest house. I can bring it here while you prepare the chest." Amber nodded. "I'll say I'm going to help clean the shed. Grandma always says it needs to be tidied up, but she never has time." "Perfect. I'll go to town to get the truck and be back in half an hour. Meanwhile, try to get everything ready." They separated, each with their mission. Amber entered the house trying to appear casual, but her heart was racing. Grandma Ruth was in the living room, watching her favorite soap opera. "Grandma, I'm going to tidy up the shed." "It needs it, don't you think?" Amber said, trying to sound as natural as possible. Grandma Ruth looked at her granddaughter with surprise. "Now? In the midday heat?" "It's just that. I met a friend from the city who's passing through. She's going to help me later, so I wanted to get some things done first," she sighed, feeling a pang of guilt. Her grandmother smiled, satisfied. "It's good to see you interested in household chores. There are some clean cloths in the service area cabinet. And be careful with your grandfather's tools. They're old, but still useful." Amber breathed a sigh of relief. In the service area, she took the cloths and discreetly some gardening gloves and a roll of rope she found in a box. She also pilfered the small first aid kit that her grandmother kept for emergencies. In the shed, she found the old wooden chest mentioned earlier. It was larger than she remembered, made of dark, sturdy wood with metal hinges already rusted by time. She moved tools and other objects that were on top and around it, creating space to work. She lined the bottom with clean cloths and checked if the lid still closed properly. When she finished the preparations, she heard the discreet sound of a horn. Jason had arrived with the truck, strategically parking it at the back of the property. Amber ran to him. "I got everything. The chest is ready," she informed in a low voice. "Great, I brought some equipment that might help," he replied, showing a box with special gloves, a small veterinary kit, and a thermal blanket. Now comes the trickiest part, transferring the anaconda to the chest. They approached again the place where the animal was resting. The snake hadn't moved much, a sign that its condition remained delicate. "I'll try to hold her head first," Jason explained as he put on the thick gloves. "It's the most dangerous part. I need you to help with the body afterward, being very careful not to aggravate the wound." Amber nodded, swallowing hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she put on her grandmother's gardening gloves. "And ready?" Jason asked, positioning himself. "Ready," she replied, even though she felt her legs might give way at any moment. The biologist slowly approached the anaconda with calculated and precise movements. The serpent noticed the approach, its eyes fixed on Jason's, but it was too weak to react vigorously. With a quick and firm movement, he managed to hold the animal's head, exactly as he had learned during his training. "Now, Amber, help me with the body," he exclaimed, keeping his voice low so as not to alarm the snake even more. Amber approached, trembling but determined. She touched the cold and surprisingly dry scales of the anaconda, feeling the power of the animal, even in its weakened state. With great effort, the two began to lift the heavy body, trying to keep the wound protected. That's when they heard Grandma Ruth's voice in the distance, calling for Amber. "Amber! Where are you, girl?" Grandma Ruth's voice sounded closer. Amber's heart raced even more. If her grandmother found them in that situation, the entire plan would be ruined. "She can't see us like this," she whispered desperately to Jason. "Continue," he replied firmly, without releasing the anaconda's head. "We need to finish this quickly." With an additional effort, motivated by the fear of being discovered, they managed to lift the serpent completely. The animal was heavier than they had imagined, its muscular body requiring all the strength they possessed. They walked as quickly as possible toward the shed where the chest awaited them. "Amber, there's a young lady looking for you here." Grandma Ruth's voice was dangerously close to the shed now. Amber shot a confused look at Jason. What young lady could that be? She wasn't expecting anyone. "Just a few more meters," the biologist encouraged, sweat running down his face due to the physical effort and the tension of the moment. When they finally reached the open chest, they carefully placed the anaconda inside. Jason released the animal's head last, quickly closing the lid. Amber quickly passed the rope around the chest, tying it tightly to ensure it wouldn't open during transport. "Amber, what are you doing in there?" Grandma Ruth called, her voice already at the entrance of the shed. In a desperate move, Amber pushed Jason behind a pile of old tools and positioned herself in front of the chest, trying to appear casual, despite the sweat that ran down her face and her panting breath. "Hi, Grandma. I'm here organizing things like I said I would," she replied, forcing a smile. Grandma Ruth appeared at the door, accompanied by a young woman whom Amber recognized immediately. "Cassie, her friend from New Orleans who had mentioned the possibility of visiting Riverdale during the vacation. Amber had completely forgotten about this visit with all the excitement. "Look who arrived as a surprise," Grandma Ruth announced, smiling. "Cassie took the bus last night. She just arrived a little while ago." Cassie, a girl with tanned skin and curly hair tied in a ponytail, smiled radiantly. "Surprise! I managed to move up the trip," she exclaimed, hugging her friend. Amber returned the hug mechanically, her mind working frantically to find a way out of the increasingly complicated situation. "That's wonderful, Cassie," she managed to say. "I was just organizing the shed so we'd have more space. Grandma, can you show Cassie the room where she'll be staying? I'll finish this quickly and join you." Grandma Ruth looked suspiciously at her granddaughter. She seemed to notice something strange in her behavior. "What's in that chest that you're tying with such dedication?" she asked, approaching. Panic took over Amber. At any moment, the anaconda could move, making noise inside the chest. "Oh, just some of Grandpa's old tools," she replied hastily. "I want to take them to town to see if they can be fixed. I thought, Kev asking Jason for help, he has a truck." Hearing his name, Jason emerged from his improvised hiding place, pretending he had just entered the shed. "Mrs. Ruth, what a pleasure to see you," he greeted politely, extending his hand to the lady who looked at him in surprise. "Jason, what are you doing here?" Grandma Ruth asked, clearly confused by the situation. "I came to help Amber with the tools," he replied, trying to sound convincing. "She found me in the square and mentioned the restoration project." Cassie observed the scene with growing interest, noting Amber's obvious nervousness and the exchanges of glances between her and the unfamiliar, a young man. "Restoration project?" Grandma Ruth questioned, increasingly suspicious. "Yes, Grandma," Amber intervened quickly. "Remember how Grandpa always said he wanted to restore these old tools? I thought I'd do that as a tribute to him." The mention of her late husband softened Grandma Ruth's expression. Her eyes watered slightly. "Ah, your grandfather would be very happy," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He loved those tools." Amber felt terribly guilty for using her grandfather's memory as an excuse, but there was no other way out at the moment. "Jason is going to help me take the chest to town. We'll be back soon, I promise," she added, giving Cassie a meaningful look, hoping her friend wouldn't ask more questions. To her surprise, Cassie smiled conspiratorially. "I can wait, no problem. Actually, I'm exhausted from the trip. I'd love to take a shower and rest a bit." Grandma Ruth nodded, still drying a discreet tear. "Let's go then, let Amber take care of this," she said, leading Cassie out of the shed. Before leaving, she turned to Amber. "Don't be too long, okay? Lunch is almost ready." As soon as they were alone, Amber and Jason exchanged looks of relief. "That was close," he whispered. "Let's hurry before something else happens." With difficulty, they carried the heavy chest to the truck and accommodated it in the bed, covering it with a tarp to avoid curious onlookers. Amber ran to the house to get her bag and let them know she was leaving. When she returned, she noticed something disturbing. The chest was moving slightly on the truck bed. "Jason, the chest is moving." Amber alerted in panic, pointing to the truck bed. The biologist ran to check. The anaconda, even weakened, was beginning to show signs of restlessness inside the improvised compartment. The ropes that tied the chest creaked with the pressure, applied from within. "We need to leave now," Jason decided, quickly adjusting the ties. "The snake is stressed by the confinement. The longer we delay, the more agitated she'll become." Amber hesitated for a second. She was about to embark on a journey with a young man she barely knew, transporting a giant injured snake without properly notifying her grandmother or Cassie. "What if my friend gets suspicious? What if my grandmother calls my mum?" she questioned, suddenly aware of the possible consequences of her actions. Jason looked at her seriously. "Amber, I understand your concern, but every minute counts to save this animal. If you prefer to stay, I'll understand. I can try to take the anaconda alone." Something in the young biologist's determination touched Amber deeply. He was willing to face all the risks for an animal that many would consider just a threat. She couldn't abandon him now. Besides, a part of her, which she didn't even know existed, was curiously connected to the fate of that creature. "Let's go," she finally said, climbing into the passenger seat. Jason smiled, relieved, and started the tool truck. They left through the back of the property, avoiding passing the front of the house where Grandma Ruth might see them. As they moved away from Riverdale, the dirt road became more irregular, violently shaking the vehicle. Each bump caused agitated movements of the chest in the truck bed, increasing Amber's anxiety. "How long until we reach the rehabilitation center?" she asked, nervously watching through the rearview mirror. "If we don't have problems, about 2 hours," Jason replied, concentrating on driving. "The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center is on the outskirts of Port Gibson, but we'll have to cross some very precarious stretches of road." Amber nodded silently. Silence settled between them for a few minutes, broken only by the noise of the engine and the occasional thumps from the chest. "Why are you doing this?" Amber finally asked, studying the concentrated profile of the young man. "I mean, why risk so much for a snake that most people would prefer to see far away?" Jason smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "When I was 10, my father was a park ranger," he began, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "He sometimes took me to the forest. On one of these occasions, we found a panther injured by hunters. Everyone at the camp said to leave it, that it was better that way, that it was one less threat. But my father didn't think that way. He paused, avoiding an especially large pothole in the road. He said that each animal has its role, its place in the cycle of life. If we remove one of them, the whole system becomes unbalanced. My father treated that panther in secret from everyone for weeks. When it got better, it disappeared into the forest. Many called my father crazy, but 6 months later, when a flood hit our region, that same panther appeared in our yard with 2 cubs. It was as if it had come to show that his choice had been worth it." Amber listened to the story, fascinated. Now she better understood Jason's passion for preserving the local fauna. "And your father, does he know you're continuing his legacy?" she asked. Jason's expression subtly darkened. "My father passed away 5 years ago. Heart problem, common among the men in my family. I decided to study biology in his honor. When I graduated, I promised I would follow in his footsteps, respecting all forms of life." Amber felt a wave of emotion as she realized the depth of Jason's motives. It wasn't just science, it was a personal connection, an honor to the memory of someone loved. "I'm sorry about your father," she said sincerely. "He would be proud." Jason thanked her with a nod, visibly moved. The moment of connection was interrupted by a more violent jolt. The truck shuddered, and a sharp noise of metal indicated that something was wrong. "Damn!" Jason exclaimed, reducing speed and pulling over the vehicle. "What happened?" Amber asked in alarm. "I think we blew a tire," he replied, turning off the engine. They got out to check, and indeed the right rear tire was completely flat, probably punctured by some sharp rock on the irregular road. "Do we have a spare?" Amber questioned worriedly, looking around and noticing that they were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by dense vegetation. "Yes, but it will take a while to change," Jason replied, already opening the tool compartment. While he prepared the jack and the necessary tools, Amber checked the chest in the truck bed. The anaconda seemed to have calmed down a bit, but still moved occasionally. It was then that they heard the roar of an engine approaching. An old truck was emerging around the bend in the road, slowing down when it spotted the stopped pickup. The truck stopped a few meters from the pickup. Amber felt a chill when she recognized the moss-green vehicle with a bed adapted for hunting. Transport. It was Mr. Gerald's truck, the famous hunter from Riverdale. "Stay calm," whispered Jason, noticing her discomfort. "Act naturally." Mr. Gerald, a middle-aged man with an unshaven beard and a worn straw hat, got out of the truck. His small, attentive eyes examined the situation with curiosity. He wore a faded checkered shirt and muddy boots, carrying a machete in a leather sheath at his waist. "Hello, young folks, problems on the road?" he asked, walking toward them with firm steps. "Flat tire, Mr. Gerald," Jason replied politely, trying to appear casual. "We're fixing it." "Jason Parker, the biologist, isn't it?" the man asked, coming closer. "And you're Ruth's granddaughter, if I'm not mistaken." Amber forced a smile, while her heart beat unevenly. "That's right, I'm Amber. You have a good memory." The hunter smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by tobacco. "Nothing escapes a hunter's eyes, girl," he replied with certain pride. "Even the smallest details count in the wild." His curious gaze shifted to the covered chest in the truck bed, which at that exact moment trembled slightly. Amber felt her blood run cold. "What are you carrying there with such care?" he asked. Pointing to the chest, Jason intervened quickly. "They're research equipment, sensitive to humidity and heat. That's why the extra protection." Mr. Gerald frowned, clearly suspicious. He walked slowly toward the truck bed, his eyes never leaving the chest. "Equipment, huh? What kind of equipment moves by itself?" Amber shot a desperate look at Jason, who maintained admirable composure. "They're instruments with metallic components. When the temperature changes, they expand and contract, causing this apparent movement," explained the biologist, using his scientific knowledge to create a plausible excuse. Mr. Gerald seemed to consider the explanation for a moment. Then, to the young people's relief, he shrugged. "If you need help with the tire, I can lend a hand," he offered, turning his attention to the more visible problem. "Thank you, but we're almost done," Jason replied, speeding up his work with the jack. "Are you heading back to Riverdale?" "No, I'm going the other way. I have some acquaintances in Port Gibson who called me for a special hunt," he replied, his gaze gaining a peculiar gleam. "They say there's a giant snake causing problems there. It's already taken 2 head of cattle from a farm near the river." Amber felt a knot in her stomach. Could it be possible that the anaconda they were transporting was the same one sought by the farmers? "An anaconda?" she asked, trying to appear merely curious. "That's right, girl. A monster from what they tell. But it won't be a problem for me. I know all the tricks of these creatures." Mr. Gerald ran his hand over the handle of his machete in an almost affectionate gesture. "I've captured many like this one. The secret is to hit right here," he explained, touching his own nape. "One precise blow and that's it. They don't suffer much." Amber felt nauseous imagining the fate the anaconda would have if they hadn't found it first. Jason, noticing her discomfort, hurried to finish changing the tire. "Well, we're ready to continue our journey," he announced, putting away the tools. "Thanks for offering help, Mr. Gerald." The hunter nodded and cast a last suspicious look at the chest. "Be careful with this road. There are many potholes ahead and last week's rain left some parts almost impassable," he warned, returning to his truck. "Oh, and if you spot any large anaconda around, let me know. I'm offering a reward for its location." When Mr. Gerald's truck finally disappeared around the bend in the road, Amber and Jason exchanged looks of relief. "That was close," she whispered, still trembling. "Very close," Jason agreed, wiping his sweaty face with his hand. "And now, we know we're not dealing with just any anaconda. She's being actively hunted. Do you think it's the same one? The one that was causing problems at the farms?" Jason approached the chest, examining it carefully. "It's possible. The injury she has could have been caused by a previous capture attempt. That would explain why she was so far from her usual habitat, close to your grandmother's house. She was fleeing." Amber felt a new wave of determination. "We have to reach the rehabilitation center before Mr. Gerald discovers what we're doing," she said firmly. Jason nodded, admiring the young woman's courage. "Let's go then. And we need to be more careful from now on." They resumed the journey in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The road became increasingly difficult, requiring all of Jason's attention and skill at the wheel. As she watched the landscape pass by the window, Amber couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Gerald had said. The anaconda was being hunted for attacking cattle. It was just following its instincts, seeking food, and for that it would be sacrificed. "Is it fair to condemn an animal for following its nature?" she suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Jason glanced briefly at Amber before returning his attention to the bumpy road. "That's a complicated question," he replied after a few seconds of reflection. "The farmers see the cattle as sustenance, as their way of surviving. The anaconda sees the same cattle as food, its way of surviving. Two natural instincts in conflict." Amber observed the clouds that were beginning to form on the horizon, harbinger of a possible Louisiana downpour. "But it's us humans who invaded their territory first, isn't it?" Jason smiled, impressed with the young woman's perspective. Exactly. It's what I always say in my lectures. There are no problematic animals. There are ecological imbalances caused by human interference. When we destroy natural habitats, restrict food sources, animals need to adapt or perish. The sky was beginning to take on orange hues, announcing that the afternoon was advancing. The light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, created a hypnotizing play of shadows on the dirt road. "How did your interest in biology begin?" Amber asked, genuinely curious about the young man who, in a matter of hours, had become her accomplice in an unlikely mission. "Besides my father's influence, I think it was always in me," he replied, avoiding another deep pothole. "I grew up in a riverside community where our survival depended directly on knowledge about nature. I learned early which plants served as medicine, which animals we could hunt without compromising the balance, how the river changed its behavior with the seasons." He paused, a nostalgic smile appearing on his lips. "There was a teacher at the community school who came from New Orleans who noticed my interest. He would lend me books, scientific journals. It was he who encouraged me to take the college entrance exam, said I had the mind of a scientist." "And your family? How did they react?" Jason's expression became more serious. "My mother was afraid. For her, studying in New Orleans meant moving away from traditions, forgetting my roots. My father, however, insisted that I should go. Knowledge is never too much," he would say. "You can learn what they have to teach without forgetting what you already know." Amber felt a deep connection with that story. She too lived between two worlds, the hustle and bustle of New Orleans and the ancestral tranquility of Riverdale. "And you? What's your dream?" Jason asked, returning the curiosity. Amber hesitated. No one had asked her that question so directly before. "Journalism, I think," she finally replied. "I like to tell stories, to find the truth behind appearances. My mother wants me to study law or medicine, something more stable, as she says." "And what do you want?" The question caught Amber by surprise. She was so used to thinking about what others expected of her that she rarely reflected on her own desires. "I want to be free to choose my path," she replied after a moment. "Like this anaconda. She didn't ask to be hunted just for following her nature." Jason nodded, understanding the depth of that seemingly simple thought. Silence reigned between them again, but it was a comfortable silence, of mutual understanding. The landscape around became denser, with the forest advancing over the road in some stretches. Suddenly, the sky darkened even more, and fat raindrops began to fall on the windshield of the truck. "Great, just what we needed," Jason muttered, turning on the windshield wipers. "The rain will make the road even more dangerous." As if to confirm his words, the truck slid slightly when passing through a deeper puddle. Jason controlled the vehicle skillfully, but the concern was stamped on his face. "How much longer until we get there?" Amber asked, checking the chest through the rear window. The rain fell on the tarp covering it, creating a rhythmic sound. "About 40 minutes under normal conditions. With this rain, maybe an hour or more," he replied, reducing speed to maintain control on a tight curve. The storm intensified rapidly, as is common in Louisiana. Lightning cut through the sky, momentarily illuminating the forest around. The deafening noise of thunder made the interior of the truck vibrate. "Maybe we should stop and wait for the rain to pass," Amber suggested, worriedly observing the road. That was beginning to turn into mud. "We can't," Jason replied, tense. "The anaconda needs urgent care, and we're already at the time limit." At that moment, lightning struck near the road, startling both of them. The intense flash was followed by a clap that seemed to tear the sky. The anaconda inside the chest reacted violently to the scare, shaking the truck bed. "She's agitated," Amber exclaimed, looking back. "It's the noise and vibration," Jason explained. "Snakes are very sensitive to ground vibrations. The thunder must be stressing her even more." Another lightning strike, another jolt from the chest. The truck continued slowly on the muddy road, the tires struggling to maintain traction. "Jason, look!" Amber pointed ahead, where the road seemed to disappear under a puddle of water that looked more like a small lake. That's not just a puddle, Jason murmured, slowing down even more until stopping completely a few meters from the flooded stretch. The rain must have caused a nearby creek to overflow. The muddy water covered the road for at least 20 meters ahead, with a visible current crossing the path. Branches and other debris floated, dragged by the force of the water. "We can't cross this," Amber stated, feeling discouragement take over. "We'll have to wait for the water to recede." Jason turned off the engine and remained silent for a few moments, assessing the situation. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, drumming on the roof of the truck. "And how long would that take?" he asked rhetorically, running his hand through his damp hair. "Hours, maybe a whole day. The Anaconda doesn't have that time." The two got out of the truck, protecting themselves as best they could from the rain, and walked to the edge of the flooding to better assess the situation. The water ran with considerable force, but didn't seem very deep in the center. "I think the truck can handle it," Jason commented, mentally measuring the height of the water. "The risk is the engine getting wet or us being dragged by the current." "It's too dangerous," Amber protested. "What if we get stuck in the middle, or if the chest falls into the water?" Jason looked at the stormy sky, then at his watch. "It's getting dark fast. If we stay here, we'll have to spend the night on the road, in the middle of the forest, with an injured Anaconda in the truck bed. Besides, we don't know how long this water will take to recede." He was right, and Amber knew it. They were too far to go back, and moving forward was the only viable option, if they wanted to save the Anaconda. "Let's check the chest one more time before trying," she suggested, walking to the truck bed. When they partially removed the tarp, they could see that the Anaconda was quieter now, possibly exhausted from the stress and the injury. Jason took the opportunity to quickly examine the animal's condition. "The wound doesn't seem to be bleeding anymore, but she's very weak," he noted, concerned. "We need to reach the center as soon as possible." They replaced the tarp, tying it more firmly to protect the chest from the water. Jason also took the opportunity to check the fuel level and the condition of the tires. "We still have half a tank. It should be enough to get there," he said, returning to the driver's seat. "Amber, you can stay here if you prefer. I can try to cross alone." Amber looked at the young biologist, soaked by the rain, determined to move forward even in the face of danger. She had known him for less than a day, but already felt an inexplicable confidence in him. Besides, something inside her refused to abandon the mission in which she had become involved. "No way," she replied firmly. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." Jason smiled, visibly relieved not to have to face the challenge alone. "Okay then, put on your seatbelt and hold on. We'll go slowly and very carefully." He started the engine and moved slowly toward the water. When the front tires touched the edge of the flooding, the truck trembled slightly. "Here we go," Jason murmured, keeping his hands firm on the steering wheel. The vehicle entered the water, which soon rose to the middle of the wheels. The truck advanced with difficulty, the current pushing it slightly to the side. Jason constantly compensated for the direction, keeping them in what appeared to be the center of the submerged road. "It's working!" Amber exclaimed, allowing herself a smile of relief when they reached the middle of the flooded stretch. It was at that moment that they felt a violent jolt. The truck tilted to the right as if one of the tires had fallen into a hole. "Damn!" Jason exclaimed, trying to control the vehicle. The engine roared louder when he accelerated to try to get out of the depression. The water now reached almost to the door, and the truck seemed unable to advance. Amber felt panic grow when she realized they were stuck in the middle of a flooded road, with night falling and a storm punishing the region. "We're going to be stuck here," she whispered, more to herself than to Jason. "No, we're not," he replied, with determination. "I'll try to back up and take another path." He put the truck in reverse and carefully accelerated. The vehicle moved a few centimeters backward, but soon stopped again. The wheels were spinning without getting traction. "I'll have to get out and push," Jason decided, already opening the door. "No," Amber held his arm. "It's too dangerous. The current could drag you away." "We don't have a choice," he replied. "You stay at the wheel. When I shout, accelerate gently, okay?" Before Amber could protest again, Jason had already gotten out into the water that reached above his knees. The rain punished his body as he positioned himself in front of the truck. "Now!" he shouted, starting to push. Amber accelerated gently, feeling the vehicle move a few centimeters. Jason pushed with all his strength, the water making his movements difficult. Slowly, the truck began to move, coming out of the depression. When it finally got traction, it advanced quickly, almost knocking Jason down. "Careful!" shouted Amber, seeing him stagger in the water. The biologist managed to balance himself and ran to the driver's door, which Amber had already opened for him. He entered soaking wet, panting, but with a triumphant smile. "We did it!" he exclaimed, taking control of the vehicle. "Let's get out of this water now." They continued advancing carefully, and after what seemed like an eternity, finally reached the other side of the flooding. The truck climbed onto firmer ground with a final effort from the engine. It was almost night when they spotted the first lights of Port Gibson. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, and the sky was beginning to clear in some spots, revealing shy stars. "We made it," Jason announced, relief evident in his exhausted voice. Amber observed the small town, appearing ahead. Port Gibson, known for its ecotourism and proximity to the Black River Nature Reserve, had a welcoming air even at that hour. Some inns displayed illuminated signs, and riverside restaurants showed movement of people. "Where exactly is the rehabilitation center?" she asked, feeling renewed anxiety now that they were so close to their destination. "On the outskirts of the town, about 10 minutes from here. It's a more isolated area, perfect for working with wild animals," Jason replied, following a secondary road that skirted the urban center. As they moved away from the town, the darkness became denser, broken only by the headlights of the truck and by occasional flashes of distant lightning. The road was now better maintained, allowing them to advance with more confidence. "How did you find out about this place?" Amber questioned, trying to keep the conversation going to ward off the fatigue that was beginning to weigh on both of them. "I did an internship there during college," Jason explained. "The director, Dr. Helen, was my advisor on my senior thesis. She's a reference in reptile conservation in Louisiana." "And do you think she'll help us, even arriving like this without warning?" Jason smiled. "Helen is one of those people who put the lives of animals above any bureaucracy. I'm sure she'll help us." After a few minutes, Jason reduced speed and turned into an almost imperceptible entrance, marked only by a discreet sign with the name Louisiana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. A gravel road led them to a set of low buildings, painted in earthy tones that camouflaged with the surrounding vegetation. Yellowish lights shone in some windows, indicating that despite the hour there was activity at the location. They parked near the main entrance, and Jason honked twice, apparently a known code, as soon a middle-aged woman came out to receive them. She wore a white lab coat over casual clothes and had her graying hair tied in a practical bun. "Jason?" she called, approaching the truck with a flashlight in hand. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "Helen," he replied, quickly getting out of the vehicle. "Sorry to arrive like this, but it's an emergency." Amber got out too, observing the interaction between the two. The mutual respect they shared was evident. "We have an injured anaconda in the truck bed," Jason continued, guiding Helen to the back of the truck. "We found her near Riverdale with a deep cut on her back, probably a hunting attempt." Helen examined the chest covered by the tarp with a serious expression. "How long has she been injured?" "We don't know for sure. We found her this morning." The veterinarian nodded and called some assistants who were in the main building. "We'll take her to the treatment room immediately," she ordered with quiet authority. "Raphael, prepare the large table. Julia, separate the kit for suturing large animals." Quickly, a small team formed around the truck. With great care, they removed the chest from the truck bed and transported it into the main building. Amber and Jason followed them, exhausted but anxious to see the outcome of that journey. The interior of the center impressed Amber. Despite its rustic appearance from the outside, inside it was a modern facility with state-of-the-art equipment. The room where they took the anaconda was spacious, with a large central stainless steel table and various monitoring machines. "You two wait outside," Helen instructed when they began to open the chest. "We need space to work." Amber hesitated, reluctant to move away now. "Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice revealing all the concern accumulated during the day. Helen gave her an understanding look. "We'll do everything possible," she replied with honesty. "You've already done a lot by bringing her here. Now leave it to us." Jason gently led Amber to a small adjacent waiting room. Both collapsed into simple chairs, fatigue finally taking over. "It's strange," Amber commented after a long silence. "I never imagined I would care so much about a snake. Actually, I've always been afraid of them." Jason smiled, perfectly understanding what she meant. That's what happens when we allow ourselves to see beyond our prejudices. We discover that the things we fear are often just misunderstood. They remained silent again, listening to the muffled sounds coming from the treatment room. Occasionally, a team member would rush out and return with equipment or medications. Helen appeared almost 2 hours later, removing her surgical gloves. "So?" Jason asked, rising immediately. The veterinarian smiled slightly. "The wound was deep, but we managed to clean and suture it. There was no serious infection, fortunately. She lost a lot of blood, is dehydrated and weak, but her chances are good." Amber felt a wave of relief so intense that her eyes watered. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for helping her and for receiving us like this, without warning." Helen nodded, a gentle smile softening the lines of fatigue on her face. "You took a great risk bringing her here," she observed, "and from what Jason quickly told me, you faced Mr. Gerald, impassable roads, and a storm, all for an anaconda. That's admirable." 3 weeks passed since that stormy night. Amber extended her vacation period in Riverdale to the despair of her mother in New Orleans, who didn't understand her daughter's sudden interest in the quiet riverside town. Grandma Ruth, on the other hand, was delighted with her granddaughter's prolonged presence, especially because Amber now actively participated in the house routine, waking up early to help with breakfast, tending to the garden with an enthusiasm she had never shown before. "This girl came back, different from that trip," Grandma Ruth commented to Cassie, who had also extended her stay. "I've never seen her so interested in plants and animals." Cassie smiled, keeping to herself what she knew. After Amber's return that night, soaked and exhausted, her friend had told her everything about the adventure with the anaconda. Far from judging, Cassie was fascinated by the story and became an accomplice in the secret. On that sunny Sunday morning, Amber was finishing getting ready. She had arranged with Jason to visit the rehabilitation center again. In the past weeks, they had made this trip several times, always with the excuse of visiting a craft exhibition in Port Gibson, a story that Grandma Ruth accepted without questioning. "Too much. Are you sure you don't want to come with us?" Amber asked Cassie, who was lying in the hammock on the porch leafing through a magazine. "Not today," replied her friend with a mischievous smile. "I think you two deserve some time alone." Amber blushed slightly. She couldn't deny that. Besides, the interest in the anaconda's recovery, another reason, repeatedly took her to Port Gibson. In a few weeks, Jason had become someone special in her life. The long conversations during the trips, the shared interest in nature, the admiration for his commitment to his profession, all this had created a connection that went beyond friendship. The sound of Jason's truck interrupted her thoughts. She said goodbye to Cassie and went out, finding the biologist leaning against the vehicle, wearing khaki pants and a light blue shirt that enhanced the tan of his skin. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, opening the door for her. Amber felt butterflies in her stomach. Today would be the day of the anaconda's release, now completely recovered. Helen had called the day before, informing that all tests indicated the animal was healthy and strong enough to return to nature. As part of a research project, the anaconda would receive a small transmitter that would allow scientists to monitor its movements for a few months. The trip to the center transpired in a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. Amber had followed the entire process of the anaconda's recovery, from the first critical days to the last weeks, when the animal was already feeding normally and demonstrating all the strength and vitality characteristic of the species. "Nervous?" Jason asked. Noticing the young woman's silence, "A little," she admitted. "It's strange, but I feel like I'm saying goodbye to a friend." Jason smiled, understanding. "It's natural, you created a bond with her, but remember, the greatest act of love for a wild animal is returning it to freedom." At the center, they found Helen and her team already prepared for the transport. The anaconda had been placed in a special container, much more sophisticated than the improvised chest they had used weeks ago. Through a small observation window, Amber could see that the animal was alert, its scales bright and healthy, without any sign of the wound that had almost cost its life. "She's magnificent," Helen commented, approaching. "And you arrived at the perfect time. We'll leave in 30 minutes for the release site." The place chosen to return the anaconda to nature was about an hour from the center, in a conservation area on the banks of the Black River, far from human communities that could represent danger to the animal. During the journey, Helen explained to Amber the details of the monitoring they would do. "The transmitter is tiny and doesn't hinder her movements or behavior at all. It will give us valuable information about territory, feeding habits, and migration patterns. This information can help create better conservation strategies for the species." They arrived at a clearing near the river, where the forest met the water on a beach of light sand. The day was perfect. Blue sky, bright sun reflecting on the dark waters of the Black River, a light breeze swaying the treetops. It seemed that nature itself was celebrating the return of one of its children. With great care, the team positioned the container near the riverbank. Helen did a quick final examination of the anaconda and confirmed that everything was in order. It was time for goodbye. "Would you like to do the honors?" she asked Amber, surprising her. "Me? But I don't know if..." "You found her, helped, saved her and followed her recovery. Nothing more fair than you opening the door to her new life," Helen insisted with an encouraging smile. Jason gently squeezed Amber's shoulder in support. "Go ahead, you can do it." With her heart racing, Amber approached the container. She remembered when she first saw the anaconda, injured and vulnerable, in the back of her grandmother's house. She remembered the initial fear, the compassion that arose afterward, the dangerous journey, the storm, the encounter with Mr. Gerald, the struggle to reach the center. It had all been worth it for this moment. With a decisive movement, she opened the container door and stepped back a few paces, giving space to the animal. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the anaconda's head emerged in the opening, its forked tongue testing the air, its alert eyes examining the environment. The silence was absolute. The entire team, Amber and Jason, observed, holding their breath. With gradual and elegant movements, the serpent began to slide out, its muscular body reflecting the sunlight in greenish and golden tones. It was a spectacle of wild, primitive, hypnotizing beauty. When it was completely out of the container, the anaconda paused, as if reorienting itself. It was at this moment that something extraordinary happened. The serpent turned its head slightly toward Amber, and for a brief instant their gazes met. There was no fear, neither on Amber's part nor on the animal's, just a mutual recognition, a silent connection between two creatures who had shared an unlikely journey. Then, with a fluid movement, the anaconda slid toward the water, diving into the dark depths of the Black River. Concentric circles marked the spot where it had disappeared, expanding and eventually dissolving in the current. Amber felt warm tears running down her face. Jason approached, putting an arm around her shoulders. "She'll be fine," he assured in a low voice. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to us," Amber corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. On the way back to the center, the mood was one of contained celebration. Helen's team chatted animatedly about the data they would begin to receive in the coming days. Amber, however, was silent, absorbing everything she had experienced. "What are you thinking about?" Jason asked, when they finally were alone, sitting on the steps of the center's porch while the team organized the equipment inside. "About how life takes turns," she replied, contemplating the sunset that was beginning to paint the sky orange and pink. "A month ago I was bored at my grandmother's house, complaining about the quiet life in Riverdale. Now I think I've finally found what I want to do with my life." "And what would that be?" he asked, genuinely interested. "I want to study environmental journalism," Amber replied with conviction. "Tell stories like that of our anaconda. Make people understand that these animals are not monsters. They are beings essential to the balance of nature. Use words to create bridges between the human world and the natural one." Jason smiled, his eyes shining with admiration. "You would be amazing at that," he said sincerely. "You have the heart and courage needed." Amber turned to face him. "And there's something else I discovered on this journey," she confessed, feeling her heart accelerate. "What?" he asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Amber leaned in and kissed him softly. For a moment of surprise, Jason remained still, but soon corresponded to the kiss, embracing her in his arms. When they separated, both were smiling, a bit shy, but with the certainty that this was just the beginning of something special. "I think I also discovered some things on this journey," Jason confessed, holding her hand between his. The sun continued its descent on the horizon, bathing them in a golden light. At the center, Helen observed the couple through the window, smiling, with approval. And somewhere in the depths of the Black River, an anaconda slid freely, its powerful body cutting through the waters with renewed grace and strength. 6 months later, Amber was back in Riverdale for the end-of-year holidays. Grandma Ruth's house was decorated for Christmas, with colored lights adorning the porch and a small nativity scene in the living room. Jason, now officially her boyfriend, had come to spend the holidays with her. Sitting on the porch after the Christmas dinner, Jason was showing Amber the latest data from the anaconda's monitoring. The animal was thriving, had established a wide territory, and to the researchers' delight, showed signs of being pregnant. "She found her place," Amber commented, moved by the news. "Just like us." The next morning, as they walked along the riverbank, Amber was surprised to spot Mr. Gerald getting out of his boat at the small port. The hunter recognized them immediately and, to her surprise, waved amicably. "Good morning." "Young folks," he greeted, approaching. "Amber, Ruth's granddaughter, right? And the biologist Jason Parker." "Good morning, Mr. Gerald," they responded in unison, a bit apprehensive. The hunter seemed different, more serene. Noticing their mistrust, he smiled. "You must be wondering if I'm still hunting anacondas," he commented, hitting the nail on the head of their thoughts. "The answer is no. After that day we met on the road, something changed." Amber and Jason exchanged surprised looks. "What happened?" Jason encouraged. "I arrived in Port Gibson looking for that problem anaconda, but found Dr. Helen first," he explained. "She invited me to visit the center, showed me the work they do there. I ended up becoming a volunteer. Now, instead of hunting, I help rescue animals at risk." Mr. Gerald took a small identification card from the rehabilitation center out of his pocket, showing it with pride. "My knowledge about the forest and animals is being useful in a way I never imagined," he continued. "And you know what? I'm happier this way." Amber smiled, deeply touched by the former hunter's transformation. "Helen has that effect on people," Jason commented, smiling. "She and that huge anaconda you took that day," Mr. Gerald added with an astute look. "Yes, I knew what was in that chest. An old hunter recognizes a reptile when he smells it." Amber blushed, realizing they hadn't fooled the experienced hunter. "And why didn't you stop us?" she asked, curious. Mr. Gerald looked at the river, thoughtful. "I saw the determination in your eyes," he finally replied. "The same look I had when I was young before becoming a hunter. I wanted to protect, not destroy. At some point along the way, I lost that. You reminded me of what really matters." They said goodbye cordially, with the promise to meet at the center on Amber's next visit. As they watched Mr. Gerald walk away, Jason hugged Amber from behind, together appreciating the beauty of the Black River bathed in the morning light. "See?" he whispered. "An anaconda not only found its way back to nature, but also helped a hunter find his way back to humanity." Amber smiled, leaning back into the comforting embrace. "It's like you said that day. When we allow ourselves to see beyond our prejudices, we discover that the things we fear are often just misunderstood. The river followed its eternal course, indifferent to human dramas, but an integral part of the cycle that connected all beings. In its dark waters, an anaconda swam freely, carrying in its belly the future of its species. And on the banks of that same river, two people passionate about nature and about each other contemplated the cycles of life that, like the Black River itself, always flow forward, transforming everything they touch.